While dinner was being prepared, Mr. Canis cleared the big oak dining room table of enough books so everyone could eat comfortably. He left an exceptionally thick volume entitled Architecture for Pigs on Daphne's chair so the little girl could sit on it and reach her food. Then the trio waited patiently for Mrs. Grimm, who was making a thunderous racket in the kitchen. Mr. Canis closed his eyes and sat silently. Soon his stillness began to unnerve Sabrina. Was he a mute? Was there something wrong with him? In New York City, everyone talked, or rather, everyone yelled at everyone all the time. They never sat quietly with their eyes closed when people were around. It was rude. Did he die? Daphne whispered after staring at him for some time. Suddenly, Mrs. Grimm came through the door with a big copper pot and placed it on the table. She rushed back into the kitchen and returned with a plate of salad and set it in front of Mr. Canis. As soon as the plate hit the table, the old man opened his eyes and began to eat. How did you know I liked spaghetti? It's my favorite, Daphne said happily. I know lots of things about you, Liebling. I am your Oma. Mrs. Grimm replied. Oma? Sabrina asked. What's this weird language you keep speaking? It means grandmother in German. That's where a family is from, Mrs. Grimm answered. My family is from the Upper East Side, Sabrina said stiffly. Your mother sent me letters from time to time. I know a great deal about you both. In fact, when I stopped getting them, I knew that... she sighed. That they'd abandon us, Daphne asked. Child, your mother and father didn't abandon you, Mrs. Grimm cried. Mrs. Grimm, Daphne began. Liebling, I'm not Mrs. Grimm. I'm your grandmother, the old woman said. You can call me Grandma or Oma, but never Mrs. Grimm, please. Can we call you Granny? I always wanted a granny, said Daphne. Sabrina kicked her sharply under the table, and the little girl winced. Of course, I'll be your Granny Relda, the old woman said with a smile as she took the top off the pot. Sabrina stared inside. She'd never seen spaghetti like this. The pasta was black and the sauce was a bright orange color. It smelled like sweet and spicy at the same time, and the meatballs, which were emerald green, were surely not made from any kind of meat Sabrina had ever tasted. It's a special recipe, Mrs. Grimm said, as she dished some out for Daphne. The sauce has a little curry in it, and the noodles are made with squid ink. Sabrina was disgusted, which made her decision not to eat the old woman's food even easier. This sicko lied about being the girl's dead grandmother. Who knew what she'd yanked from under the kitchen sink and added to the recipe? Arsenic? Rat poison? Clog remover? Clearly, she was trying to kill them. Of course, before Sabrina could warn her, Daphne had dug in with gusto and already swallowed a third of her plate. So, Mr. Canis says your suitcases were nearly empty. Don't you have any clothes? Mrs. Grimm asked. The police kept them, Daphne said, shoveling a huge forkful of pasta into her mouth. They said they were evidence. Kept them? That's crazy. What will they do with them? She looked at each of them and finally at Mr. Canis, who shrugged. Well, we'll just go into town and pick you out a new wardrobe. We can't have you running around naked all the time, can we? I mean, people will think we're nudists. Daphne laughed to the point of snorting, but when she saw Sabrina's disapproving face, she stopped. I was thinking that Mrs. Grimm started, but Sabrina interrupted. Who are you? And don't say you're our grandmother, because our grandmother is dead. Mrs. Grimm shifted in her seat. Mr. Canis, obviously seeing the question as his cue to retire, got up, took his empty plate, and exited the room. But I am your grandmother, Liebling, the old woman replied. Well, then why did our father tell us you died before we were born? It's complicated, and I'm not sure it's time to discuss your father's decisions. Well, if you really were our grandmother, I would think you'd be happy to discuss it, Sabrina snapped. We are all just getting settled in, and we can talk about it later, Mrs. Grimm said. Her eyes dropped to her lap. Sabrina leaped up from her seat, sending her fork clanging to the floor. Fine, I'm tired. I'd like to go to bed. Mrs. Grimm frowned. Of course, Liebling. Your room is upstairs. I will show you. We'll find it ourselves. Sabrina walked around the table, grabbed Daphne's hand, and dragged her from her chair. But I'm not done eating, said Daphne. You're never done eating. Let's go, Sabrina commanded. She marched her sister through the house and up the stairs. You're being a snot, Daphne complained. I'm trying to protect us, Sabrina argued. At the top of the stairs, they found a long hallway with 5 closed doors, 2 on each side and 1 at the end. Sabrina yanked on the closest one, but it was locked tight. She turned and tried the door behind her. It opened to a bedroom decorated with dozens of wooden tribal masks, wild-eyed and smiling hideously. The two ancient swords were mounted on the wall alongside the masks, and there were pictures of Mrs. Grimm and her husband, Basil, everywhere. Like the ones downstairs, each photo was from a different part of the world. In one picture, Basil was standing at the top of an ancient stone temple. In another, the couple were guiding a gondola through what Sabrina guessed were Venetian canals. She closed the door and tried the next door. Inside, Mr. Canis sat cross-legged on a woven mat on the floor. His hands resting on his knees. Several candles lit the nearly empty room, illuminating its sparse furnishings. There were no pictures or decorations at all. Mr. Canis opened his eyes to look at the girls. His eyebrows arched. Sabrina slammed the door without apologizing. What a nutcase, she murmured. The next door opened to reveal a queen-sized 4-poster bed with their suitcases resting on top. Sabrina pulled Daphne inside and slammed this door too. We should give her a chance. I like her, said Daphne. She sat down on the bed and let out a humph. A chance to what? Kill us in our sleep? Beat us to that monster dog of hers? No way, Sabrina said as she charged to the window and looked out at the back porch roof below. She could probably jump off it and then to the ground, but Daphne might get hurt, might hurt herself. While you were shoveling in those meatballs, did you ever think that might be made from the last couple of kids she claimed she was related to? Daphne rolled her eyes. You're gross. Sabrina scanned the bedroom, which had soft yellow walls, a slanted ceiling, and a fireplace. A red 10-speed bicycle stood in the corner. An old baseball mitt sat on a desk, and several model airplanes hung from the ceiling. There was a nightstand next to the bed with an alarm clock perched on top, and on the walls were dozens of old photographs. A particularly large one showed 2 young boys staring out over the Hudson River. Want more proof that woman is an imposter? Look at this picture. If that's our dad, then who's this kid next to him? We don't have an uncle. Do you hear that? Daphne asked, moving toward the window. Suddenly, Sabrina heard a faint whistling sound, almost like a flute coming from outside. She joined Daphne at the window and peered into the woods behind the house. At first, she thought she had seen something or someone sitting in a tree, but when she rubbed her eyes for a clearer look, there was no one there. Still, the music continued. Where is that coming from? Daphne asked. Like an answer to her question, a little light flicked outside the window. Sabrina thought it was a lightning bug. It flew up to the glass as if it were trying to get a better view of her. Then it was joined by another light. The 2 danced around each other, zipping excitedly back and forth in the air. They're so pretty, Daphne whispered as a dozen more lights joined the original 2. Within seconds, more joined them, until there were almost 100 little lights blinking and flashing outside. Sabrina reached up and unlocked the window. She wanted to get a closer look, but as she unfastened the window's latch, the bedroom door opened with a crash. Startled, the sisters spun around and found Mr. Canis looming over them. You'll leave that window closed if you know what's good for you, he growled. Chapter 2. Mr. Canis pushed the girls aside and locked the window. The little lights outside flew around, bounced off the glass several times, and buzzed as if in protest. A moment later, they were gone, and the whistling sound faded away. Mr. Canis turned and stood over Sabrina. "You are never to let anyone or anything inside this house," he said in a voice as low and scratchy as an angry dog's. "It was just some lightning bug," said Sabrina. Her face was hot and red with shock. Who was this man to think he could tell her what to do? "The doors and windows stay closed. Do you understand?" Mr. Canis said. The girls nodded. He stalked out of the room, closing the door behind them. Sabrina stood dumbfounded, trying to comprehend what had just happened. "What was that all about?" Daphne whispered. But Sabrina said nothing. She was too shaken by the encounter and didn't want her sister to hear the trembling in her voice. There was a knock at the door, and Mrs. Grimm entered the room. "Have you settled in, Lieblings?" "Mr. Canis yelled at us," Daphne cried. "I heard," the old woman said as she sat down on the bed. "Please don't be too upset with him. He can be a little grouchy, but he has your best interests at heart. Believe me, Lieblings, we are both very happy to have you here. But there are a few rules you have to follow." She paused as she looked into Sabrina's face. "And I know that what I tell you might not make a lot of sense, but the rules are in place for a reason. First, never let anyone or anything into this house without asking Mr. Canis or me if it is okay," she said. Her tone was stern and serious, and no longer that of the sweet old lady with a plate of cookies. "Second, there is a room down the hall that is locked. It's locked for a reason, and I ask that you stay away from it for the time being. We have a house guest inside, and he enjoys his privacy. You might hear some unusual noises coming from his room, but just ignore them. Do you understand?" The girls nodded. "And third, I'd prefer you stay out of the woods. And as for the rest of the house, feel free to explore. You'll notice there are plenty of books to keep you occupied." "Really? Books? I didn't notice," Sabrina said sarcastically. "If worst comes to worst, we can always dig out that old TV," Mrs. Grimm continued, as if Sabrina hadn't spoken. "Do you have pajamas?" Daphne opened one of the suitcases and pulled out 2 extra large t-shirts that read, "Bermuda is for lovers." "We have these," she said. "Okay, well, I guess they'll have to do," Mrs. Grimm said as she moved toward the door. "Good night, girls. I'm very happy to have you here. I hope pancakes for breakfast will suit you." "Absolutely," said Daphne. The old woman gave her a wink and disappeared into the hall. "She's nice," said Daphne. "Everyone who offers you pancakes is nice," Sabrina clenched her fist. "But she's not fooling me. Get some sleep. We're running away tonight." Sabrina lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to her hungry belly grumble, and planning their getaway. With a little luck, she and Daphne could hide in a neighbor's garage for a couple of days and then hitchhike back to New York City. Smirt would be furious to see them again. She might even act on her threat to skin them alive. But the girls needed to be at the orphanage when their mother and father returned. When the moon was high in the window, Sabrina nudged her sister awake. "We have to go," she whispered. Daphne sat up and rubbed her eyes, her face full of heartbreak. Why was she acting like such a baby, Sabrina wondered. Running away wasn't exactly a new experience for the two of them. The Sisters Grimm had pulled off many daring escapes from foster parents in the past. They'd tied bed sheets together and climbed out of the Mercer's window one night, feeding the pitbull Diablo meatballs stuffed with cayenne pepper to keep him busy. And after the Johnsons ordered pizza, the girls had slipped into the backseat of the delivery boy's car and were miles away before anyone noticed. Mrs. Grimm was no different than any of the other crazies. Eventually, Daphne would understand. When they were dressed, Sabrina slowly opened the door and looked out into the hallway. It was empty. And as the two girls crept out with their tiny suitcases, she used her sneaking skills to their fullest. She led them on tiptoe down the stairs, being careful to step close to the wall to avoid making them creak. At the bottom, Sabrina carefully opened the closet door so the latch wouldn't click and the stack of books inside wouldn't fall over and wake the house. She snatched their coats and helped her sister put on hers, then crept to the front door. Sabrina was just thinking that this was the easiest escape ever when she tried to turn the knob. The door was locked, and when she looked closely, she saw something unusual she hadn't noticed before. "There's a keyhole on this side of the doorknob," she whispered. "They were locked inside without a key. We have to find another way out. Follow me." The girls crept through the house. They tried all the downstairs windows only to discover each was nailed shut. They found a back door off the kitchen, but it was locked from the inside too. "This is insane," said Sabrina. "Let's go back to bed," said Daphne. "No, we have to get her keys." The little girl cocked an eyebrow. "How are we going to do that?" "They're in her purse," Sabrina whispered. A second search of the house turned up nothing. Sabrina concluded the old woman's bag was in her bedroom, which meant they had to go in to get it. They stood at Mrs. Grimm's bedroom door. Luckily, there were no locks on it. Sabrina turned the knob and the door swung open. The old woman's room was weird during the day, but downright creepy at night. The tribal masks glowed in the moonlight, and the mounted swords flashed ghostly light around the room. Mrs. Grimm snored comfortably in bed, unaware of their presence. "Where's the purse?" Daphne said, only to have Sabrina's hand clamp over her mouth. The old woman turned over, disturbed by the noise, but stayed asleep, and when it was safe, Sabrina let go of her sister's face. "Keep it down," Sabrina whispered. She scanned the room and spied the handbag in the moonlight, resting on a table on the far side of the bed. She looked at Daphne and pointed to herself with her free hand, and then pointed to the bag. Daphne shrugged. She clearly had no intention of helping. Sabrina took a small step forward to test for creaky floorboards and found them secure. "This is going to be easy," she thought. But as her confidence was building, she noticed Daphne taking an interest in one of the masks on the wall. The little girl took it off its nail and held it to her against her face. "Don't do that," Sabrina whispered. "Why not? Put it back now." The little girl frowned, but did as she was told. "There, are you happy?" she whispered. A split second later, the mask fell off the wall, landed with a loud clunk, and rolled toward the bed. Both girls dove to the floor as Mrs. Grimm sat up. "Who's there?" she asked. "Oh, it's you. What are you doing down there?" Sabrina was sure they were caught, but the old woman leaned over, picked up the mask, and set it on the nightstand. "I'll have Mr. Canis give you a new nail tomorrow," then fell back onto her pillow and within seconds was snoring as loudly as ever. "You did that on purpose," Sabrina seethed at her sister. Daphne stuck her tongue out in reply. Sabrina reached for the bag, fished around inside it for keys, then tiptoed back into the hallway with her sister behind her. Downstairs, she quietly went to work on the front door lock. There were so many keys. It took a long time to find the right one, but eventually she heard the telling click of tumblers turning. The girls waited several moments, sure that everyone else heard it, too, but when no sounds came from upstairs, they stepped outside and closed the door behind them. "Goodbye, dollhouse," Daphne said sadly as she ran her hand lovingly across the door. "We'll go through the woods," Sabrina said. "No way, the woods are creepy. Granny Relda told us to stay out of them," Daphne cried. "We don't have any choice. We don't want anyone to see us on the road and call the police." Sabrina grabbed her sister's hand and dragging her around to the back of the house. They stopped at the edge of the lawn and looked into the dark forest before them.